Greetings, quilters. We would like to show you a project that we made. One of the difficult things to do in quilting is to decide what the next project is going to be. We had a granddaughter who worked in New Zealand for 18 months, and she saw this design and asked us if we could make a quilt like this. And so this is the result of the pattern that she showed us. We would like to show you the steps that were taken to make this quilt. The first thing we did was to make a design, and then we created a test piece to see what kind of problems that we would come across. Once we had done that, we then went to our design and we designed a full-blown quilt. We then figured out what colors we needed and how many yards of each color we needed. And then we took our granddaughter with us to go shopping and find the materials that she wanted for her quilt. We then washed, dried, and ironed each piece, ready to start cutting. So now it's time to check your plans and see how many pieces of each color you need to cut. I like to lay these pieces out and lay the sashing alongside of the pieces that you have cut out. And that way you can check to make sure the sashing is going to go on the right side of the colors that you've cut, so that if there's a pattern that is directional, you can have that on the right side of the directional material. Now we're ready to sew a sashing strip to each piece of fabric, and then press to the dark side and keep things grouped together, organized. For this quilt pattern, we have 5 different color combinations. I like to lay the colors out the way they're going to be sewed together in the columns that they're going to be sewn together in before I start sewing. Pull 2 colors at a time from your storyboard, sew them together, iron to the dark side, and return them back to your storyboard. So we're ready to start cutting our blocks. I've kept them in sequence by column, and we cut them in half. It's important to make sure that both halves are equal, so measure carefully. And this cut line is going to be an important part of putting this together, so make sure that your cuts are perpendicular. So as we have cut these blocks in half, I have kept them in order of whether they're in column 1, the A side or the B side of that column, so that we will be ready to lay those out. I now like to lay each column out so that I can see that I have the right sequence, the right pattern, before I begin sewing these blocks together. We're now ready to join these blocks together. When you do, don't sew the seam completely across. Leave about an inch space so that when you join the next block underneath, you'll have room to fit the seams together and it'll go together nicely. Now we just continue sewing until we have all of the columns put together. Now that the panels are complete, you're ready to trim the edges. Remember that both sides have to be equal to each other and all the panels have to be the same, otherwise your sashing will not match together. Our quilt pattern repeats, so we're able to use the pieces from the bottom of the quilt and bring them up and sew them into the gaps that are at the top, making the quilt square. Because we were planning to use the pieces from the bottom of the quilt to fill in gaps at the top of the quilt, we cut them out carefully. Now that the panels are cut, we put them on the ironing board and iron any seams that need to be ironed down. We then lay them side by side and check to see that our fit is the way we intended it to be. We're now ready to sew 2 panels together. We do this by sewing the sashing to one panel. Once we've sewn and pressed the sashing to one side, we lay the 2 columns side by side. The intent here is to align the sashing, the diagonal sashing, so that we can sew them together. We're now ready to join the 2 columns together, and we do this by matching one point on one side and transferring that 90 degrees across to the other panel, so that when they're sewn together, the sashing will match both sides. So check your alignment as you go and put pins in. When you have this pinned, sew this column to the other column, and then repeat this process with the other two pieces, and then after they're sewn together, put a piece of sashing down through the middle and sew all four pieces together. Once you have all four pieces sewn together, then you need to press and make sure that your seam allowance is pressed flat the way you would want it to. Now's a good time to check for loose threads and dark colored threads on light background, and we go through the entire backside of the quilt top and clean up all of the loose threads and cut off any threads that we think will show on the other side. Our quilt top is finally finished and we're ready to start assembling. I like to iron the quilt back to make sure we don't have any wrinkles in that. And then we're ready to put the quilt back on the quilt frame. We put the quilt back face down, and then we put quilt batting down, and then we put the quilt top on top, and we pin that down securely so that it's stretched uniformly. All three layers are uniformly stretched, and we're ready to go. We're now ready to start pinning the quilt, and we do this so that the layers will all stay aligned while we're sewing. We need to pin it about every 4 or 6 inches apart in all directions, and you want to make sure that you're not pinning in a sewing path where you're going to be sewing, so you don't have to remove the pins as you sew. We decided to sew on either side of the sashing, and we used an air erasable pen to extend those lines. When I sew, I use lightweight textured gloves so that I can hold the material as it goes under the needle. I can stretch it in all directions, and that keeps the top, the middle, and the bottom all in line so you don't wind up with puckers in the bottom of the quilt. If you're sewing with high contrast thread, like a darker one on top and a lighter one on the bottom, to prevent this dark thread from showing, you need to hold on to the dark thread on the top before you start sewing so that it doesn't get pulled down underneath. Now that you're finished with the quilting, we lay the quilt down on the carpet, and we use our large cutting mat and a straight edge and cut around the edge to square it up and make it look nice. On some of our quilts, we prefer to have a round corner instead of the square corner, and to do that we use a plate or something that has an edge that we can follow, and in this case we cut with the plate, and it makes a very nice corner. The quilt is now finished, and the next step is going to be to put a binding around the edge. Binding works best if it's cut on the bias. To do that, fold your material at a 45-degree angle and then make all cuts parallel to that 45-degree angle. And we use a 2.5-inch wide piece of binding. Align your binding, lay the two pieces face to face, leave a 1/4-inch notch there, and sew from the notch on one side to the notch on the other side, and then iron the binding, fold it in half, and iron it again. You can do your binding ahead of time and roll it up and store it that way. We're now ready to put the binding on the quilt. We align the raw edges of the quilt and the raw edges of the binding together. Just on the start of the binding, we leave an excess foot or so of material. I like to pin it all the way around and leave excess on the finished end of the material. We sew the binding to the top of the quilt all the way around. We leave the ends loose because we're going to join those together. We do that by taking one side of the binding and cutting it at a 45-degree angle. We take the other side of the binding and overlap it a 1/2 inch and cut it at the same angle as the other one. This way we're able to use a clip, pull the quilt together, and that frees up the ends so that you can work with them. Lay them face to face and sew the 1/4-inch seam across the end of the binding. Now you can finish sewing the binding to the top of the quilt. The next thing to do is turn the quilt so that you can work on the underside and pull the binding around to the underside. We like pinning the binding to the underneath side of the quilt. It makes sewing easier. We use a hem stitch to sew this binding down, and it looks very nice. For all of our quilts, we put a name tag on the underneath side showing who made the quilt, who it was made for, and when it was made. It makes a nice record. And this is the finished quilt, and we hope you have enjoyed our presentation. Thank you.